Some places hold on to you long after you've let them go. For Tansy Greer, that place was a forgotten cabin high in the mountains where she'd learned to survive on grit and silence 30 years ago. When the sheriff handed her the deed and said, "It's all yours now," she felt something crack open inside her chest. The cabin waited just as she'd left it, empty and still. But in the middle of the dusty floor sat 2 wooden crates, bound with old rope and marked with her name. Someone had left them there, knowing she would come back. What was inside would change everything she thought she knew about the life she'd walked away from. But who left them, and what did they want her to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up to Timber Ridge had taken Tansy 3 hours, though she remembered a time when she could make it in half that. The old logging road had deteriorated over the decades, washed out in places, overgrown in others. Her truck, a '98 Ford she'd kept running through sheer stubbornness, rattled over ruts that hadn't been there when she was young. Or maybe they had been, and she'd simply been too consumed with other concerns to notice. She was 62 now, her hands weathered and strong, her face lined with the kind of creases that came from squinting into mountain sun and winter wind. Her hair, steel grey and pulled back in a practical braid, had once been the colour of creek water under autumn leaves. She'd lived in the valley town of Belmont for the past 30 years, making her living as a hunting guide for tourists who wanted to feel wild for a weekend. She taught them to track elk, to read animal signs, to respect the mountains. Most of them never truly understood, but they paid well enough. The leather journal sat on the passenger seat beside her, its cover cracked and water-stained. She'd pulled it from her closet that morning, dusting off memories she'd worked hard to bury. The early entries were almost painful to read. The breathless excitement of a 32-year-old woman who'd fled a suffocating marriage and a city that had felt like a cage. She'd arrived in these mountains with nothing but determination and a romantic notion of self-sufficiency that reality had quickly beaten out of her. Garrett Brennan had saved her life that first winter. She'd written about him extensively in the journal, an old trapper who'd found her half-frozen in a snowbank, delirious with hypothermia and pride. He'd been 70 then, gruff and taciturn, but patient in his way. He'd taught her everything: how to set traps, how to read weather in the clouds, how to shoot straight and dress a kill. The cabin she'd lived in had belonged to him, a line shack from his younger days when he'd worked timber crews. "You want to live up here? Girl, you better learn quick," he told her that first morning, handing her a rifle that felt impossibly heavy. "Mountain don't care about your reasons. It'll kill you just as dead whether you're running from something or running to something," she'd learned. God, how she'd learned. Within 2 years, she could outshoot most of the men in the valley. She could track a deer through fresh snow, could tell you what had passed by the scat it left, could survive weeks in the backcountry with nothing but what she could carry. The mountain people had been skeptical at first, this city woman playing at wilderness, but gradually she'd earned their respect. They'd started calling her by her first name instead of that woman up on Garrett's Ridge. Tansy pulled the truck to a stop where the road finally gave out, becoming nothing more than a trail too narrow and rough for vehicles. She sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking up at the pine-covered slope. The cabin was another mile up, hidden in a fold of the mountain where a spring-fed creek provided year-round water. Sheriff Boone Macklin had driven up yesterday to meet her at the property line. They'd known each other for 35 years, since before he'd worn a badge, back when he was just another young man trying to make sense of his place in the world. He'd been sweet on her once, she knew, though neither of them had ever spoken of it directly. "Legal all got sorted," he'd said, handing her the deed in a manila envelope that seemed too thin to contain something so significant. Hollis Brennan's will was clear. Everything goes to you. Property, personal effects, the whole parcel. The name had hit her like a stone to the chest. Hollis, Garrett's son, though calling him a son, felt insufficient for the complicated relationship the two men had shared. Hollis had been 40 when Tansy first met him, A quiet man with his father's steady hands and a gentleness Garrett had never possessed. He'd helped her that first year, showing up at the cabin with supplies, teaching her the things Garrett was too impatient to explain properly. When did he pass? She'd asked Boone, her voice carefully neutral. 6 months back. Heart attack. Quick, the doctor said. Probably didn't even know it was happening. Boone had shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He never married, Tansy. Lived alone in his daddy's old place down in the valley. Kept to himself, mostly. She'd nodded, not trusting herself to speak. 6 months. Hollis had been gone 6 months and she hadn't known. Hadn't felt it. Hadn't sensed the world becoming emptier by one quiet, decent man. Now climbing out of the truck, Tansy shouldered her pack and checked the pistol at her hip. A .357 she'd carried for 30 years. The weight was comforting. She wasn't expecting trouble, but the mountains had taught her that trouble often came unexpected. The hike up to the cabin was harder than she remembered. Her knees ached, her breath came shorter than it used to. She'd kept herself in good shape, but 62 wasn't 32, no matter how much you wished otherwise. The trail was overgrown but still visible, and she found herself automatically reading the signs. Deer tracks, old bear scat from last season, the scratch marks on an aspen where something had marked its territory. The cabin appeared as she crested the final rise, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. It looked exactly as she'd left it. Small, sturdy, built from local timber with a stone chimney that Garrett had laid himself. The roof had been repaired, she noticed. New shingles probably within the last few years. The windows were intact, the door solid. Someone had been maintaining it. Hollis, of course. Hollis had been taking care of it all these years. The key Boone had given her turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open with barely a creak. The interior was dim, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that cut through the windows. The smell hit her immediately. Pine, old wood, the faint mustiness of a place left closed up. But underneath that, something else. Something lived in and cared for. The furniture was sparse, as it had always been. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, a wood stove for heat and cooking. Her old trunk still sat at the foot of the bed. But in the center of the room, impossible to miss, sat 2 wooden crates. They were old packing crates, the kind used for shipping goods back when everything came by rail or wagon. Rough pine, bound with rope that had grayed with age. On the top of each, burned into the wood with what looked like a branding iron, was a single word: Tansy. Her hands trembled as she approached them. The rope on the first crate was tied in a complex knot she recognized immediately. Garrett's knot, the one he'd used for everything from securing loads to hanging game. Hollis would have learned it from him. She didn't open them immediately. Instead, she moved through the cabin slowly, reacquainting herself with the space. Someone had swept recently. The floor was clean. The wood stove had been freshly blacked. In the small pantry, she found canned goods, neatly stacked and dated. The most recent was from last fall. The bed was made with blankets she didn't recognize, a quilt that looked hand-stitched. She touched it gently, recognizing the pattern, a traditional log cabin design, each square carefully pieced. Had Hollis made this? She couldn't imagine him sitting with needle and thread, but then she'd stopped knowing what Hollis was capable of 30 years ago. On the small shelf above the table, she found a row of books. Field guides to mountain plants and animals, some old paperback westerns with cracked spines, and a thick, leather-bound volume that made her breath catch. It was Garrett's journal. She recognized it immediately. She'd seen him writing in it countless times, usually by firelight after a long day, his handwriting cramped and difficult to read. Beside it sat another journal, newer, its leather still supple. She opened it to the first page and saw Hollis's handwriting, neat and careful, where his father's had been almost illegible. Year 1, property maintenance log, it read. Roof inspection, south side needs patching. Creek running clear. No signs of intrusion. Tansy's things stored and protected. She paged forward, finding entry after entry, year after year. 30 years of notes about the cabin, the property, the changing seasons. Hollis documenting everything, maintaining everything, waiting for her. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the floor. Tansy lit one of the oil lamps. The cabin had never had electricity and finally approached the first crate. Her pocket knife made quick work of the rope, and the lid lifted easily, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, were letters. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, bundled with twine and organized by year. She lifted the first bundle, dated from 31 years ago, just after she'd left. Beneath the letters were photographs. Their edges yellowed, but the images still clear. She saw herself, younger, leaner, her face fierce with concentration as she sighted down a rifle. Garrett stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, something almost like pride in his weathered face. And Hollis, slightly out of focus, watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. There were more photographs, hunting trips, winter scenes, the cabin in various seasons. A life she'd lived and then abandoned, preserved here in black and white. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped separately, was her old leather jacket. She lifted it out, held it to her face, and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and gun oil and memory. It still fit, she discovered, slipping it on, maybe a little tighter across the shoulders, but it fit. The second crate waited, patient and mysterious. But it was getting dark, and Tansy found she couldn't face whatever was in there just yet. She needed to process what she'd already found, the letters, the photographs, the evidence of Hollis's 30 years of faithful stewardship. She built a fire in the wood stove, using kindling from the neat stack beside it, and put coffee on to boil. The familiar ritual was soothing, her hands remembering the motions even after all these years. She settled at the table with the first bundle of letters and began to read. "Dear Tansy," the first one started in Hollis's careful script. "I hope this finds you well, wherever you are. The cabin is secure. I've winterized the windows and stocked the pantry. Your things are safe. I think about you often and hope you found what you were looking for." It was signed simply H. She read through the night, letter after letter, watching Hollis's life unfold in careful, measured words. He wrote about the seasons changing, about maintaining the property, about his father's declining health and eventual death. He wrote about the valley, about people she'd known, about the slow changes that came to the mountains over decades, and threaded through it all, subtle but unmistakable, was his enduring affection for her. He never said it directly, that wasn't Hollis's way, but it was there in every careful line, every observation about something he thought she would have appreciated, every mention of keeping her things safe by dawn. She'd read only a fraction of the letters, but she understood. Hollis had spent 30 years keeping faith with a woman who'd left without saying goodbye. He'd preserved everything she'd abandoned, maintained the life she'd walked away from, and waited, always waited, for her to return. The second crate held more secrets, she knew. But those could wait for daylight. Tansy stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the ridge, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She looked older, more worn, but also more solid somehow. The mountains had a way of stripping away the unnecessary, leaving only what was essential. "I'm back, Hollis," she whispered to the empty room. "I don't know why, but I'm back." Outside, a raven called, harsh and knowing. The mountain was waking up, and so was she. The second crate called to her all through the morning. Tansy tried to ignore it, busying herself with mundane tasks, sweeping the floor again, though it didn't need it, checking the window frames, organizing the pantry. But her eyes kept drifting back to that rough pine box, with her name burned into the lid. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and flooded the cabin with pale winter light, she could put it off no longer. She approached the crate the way she might approach a wounded animal, carefully, ready for anything. The rope came away easily, and the lid lifted with a soft creak. Inside, wrapped in canvas treated with wax to keep out moisture, were Garrett's personal effects. She recognized his hunting knife first, the blade still oiled and sharp, the antler handle worn smooth from decades of use. His compass, tarnished but functional, the brass case engraved with initials she'd never been able to decipher. A tobacco pouch, long, empty, but still fragrant with the sweet smell of his preferred blend, Beneath these items lay Garrett's field journal, different from the maintenance log she'd found on the shelf. This one was older, the leather cracked and stained, filled with his almost illegible handwriting. She opened it carefully, mindful of the brittle pages. The entries were sporadic, sometimes months apart. Garrett had never been one for daily documentation. But what was there painted a picture of a man more observant and thoughtful than she'd given him credit for. He wrote about animal migrations, weather patterns, the slow change of the forest over seasons. And occasionally, briefly, he wrote about her. Girl's got sand. Read one entry from her first winter. Didn't think she'd last, but she's tougher than she looks. Reminds me of Helen, before the mountains took her. Tansy had never known Garrett had a wife. He'd never mentioned her, never spoke of a past before the mountains. She read on, hungry now for these glimpses into the old man's history. The entries from his final year were different, more urgent, less reflective. He wrote about finding survey stakes on his property, about strangers asking questions in town, about a growing conviction that someone was trying to force him out. They think I'm just an old fool, one entry read. But I know what's under this ground. Had it assayed 20 years back, kept quiet about it. Rare earth minerals, the geologist said. Worth a fortune if you could get at them. I never wanted the money, just wanted to be left alone. But now they know. Someone's been looking at old records, asking the wrong questions. Tansy's hands tightened on the journal. She remembered that last winter before Garrett died. How paranoid he'd seemed, how he'd startled at unexpected sounds. She'd attributed it to age, to the natural decline of an old man's mind. But what if he'd been right? The final entry, dated just a week before his death, made her blood run cold, told the boy. He'll know what to do. Can't trust anyone else. If something happens to me, Hollis will keep it safe. Keep her safe. The girl doesn't know, better that way. They can't hurt what they can't find. Beneath the journal lay a stack of papers, wrapped in another layer of waxed canvas. Tansy unfolded them carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. Land surveys, mineral assay reports, legal documents dense with technical language she struggled to parse. The assay report was dated 32 years ago, signed by a geologist named Dr. Raymond Porter. It detailed significant deposits of rare earth elements, neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, concentrated in a specific area of Garrett's property. Even with her limited understanding of such things, she could tell from the numbers that this was valuable. Very valuable, but there was more. At the bottom of the stack, she found a series of photographs that made her breath catch. They showed Garrett at the base of a cliff, the same cliff where she'd found his body that terrible winter morning. But in these photos, he was alive, and he wasn't alone. Another man stood with him, younger, wearing a surveyor's vest. They appeared to be arguing, Garrett's face set in anger, the other man's body language aggressive. The photos were dated just 2 days before Garrett's death. Tucked between the photographs was a letter, addressed to her in Hollis's handwriting. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Dear Tansy, if you're reading this, then I've passed on and you've come back to the cabin as I always believed you would. I've spent 30 years protecting what my father left and trying to understand what really happened to him. I don't think Dad fell. I think he was pushed. The man in those photographs is Vernon Hess. He was a claim jumper, a man who made his living stealing other people's mineral rights through legal manipulation and, when that didn't work, through intimidation. Dad had evidence. Vernon forged documents, tried to file claims on our property. When Dad threatened to go to the authorities, Vernon got desperate. I couldn't prove it then. Dad's death was ruled accidental, an old man who slipped on icy rocks. But I've kept looking, kept gathering evidence. I filed legal challenges, tried to protect the property rights. Vernon's been fighting me every step, using shell companies and lawyers. He knows what's under this ground, and he's spent decades trying to get it. I'm sorry I never reached out to you directly. Part of me wanted to protect you from this mess. Part of me knew you'd left for good reasons and didn't want to be dragged back. But mostly I think I was afraid. Afraid you'd forgotten us, forgotten this place. Afraid that the woman I remembered had moved on to something better. The second bundle in this crate contains everything I've gathered. Every document. Every piece of evidence. I don't know if it's enough to prove what Vernon did, but maybe you'll find something I missed. You always saw things others didn't. I've also included something personal, something Dad meant for you to have. The compass, it was his father's, brought over from the old country. The coordinates engraved on the back aren't random. They point to a place on the property where Dad hid his original deed and claimed documents. He didn't trust banks, didn't trust lawyers, but he trusted the mountain. I hope you've found peace wherever you are. I hope you've built a good life. But if any part of you still belongs to these mountains, if any part of you remembers what we had here, then maybe you'll see this through. Finish what Dad and I couldn't. Yours, always, Hollis. Tansy read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her chest like stones into water. Garrett murdered. Hollis spending 30 years fighting a battle she'd known nothing about. And she'd been down in Belmont, guiding city people on hunting trips, living a half-life while the men who'd saved her, who'd taught her, who'd loved her in their quiet ways, fought alone. She looked at the compass again, really looked at it. The coordinates on the back were worn but still legible. She committed them to memory. She'd always been good with numbers, could hold a map in her head for days. The photographs of Garrett and Vernon Hess stared up at her from the table. She studied Vernon's face, hard, calculating, the face of a man who saw the world as something to be exploited. He'd be older now if he was still alive. Probably thought he'd won. Thought the evidence was buried with Garrett and then Hollis. He didn't know about her. Didn't know that the quiet mountain woman who disappeared 30 years ago had come back. Didn't know that Garrett had taught her not just to hunt animals, but to track, to wait, to strike when the moment was right. She gathered the letters, the documents, the photographs, and packed them carefully in her rucksack. The compass she hung around her neck on a leather cord. Garrett's knife she slipped into the sheath at her belt next to her pistol. She was armed now, not just with weapons, but with knowledge. And knowledge, Garrett had always said, was the deadliest weapon of all. Outside, clouds were building over the ridge, promising snow. Tansy stood on the cabin's small porch, looking out at the forest she'd once called home. The weight of Hollis's letter pressed against her heart like an accusation and a benediction both. She'd left this place to escape her past, to build something new. But some debts could never be outrun, some obligations never fully abandoned. Garrett and Hollis had protected her, had kept faith when she'd given them nothing in return but silence and absence. Now it was her turn. She would find out what really happened on that cliff 30 years ago. She would make Vernon Hess answer for what he'd done. And she would finish what Garrett and Hollis had started, even if it cost her everything. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter. Tansy breathed it in, feeling something old and fierce wake up inside her. She'd been a guide for tourists too long, playing at being the person she used to be. But that woman, the one who'd learned to survive with nothing but will and a rifle, she was still there, buried under years of comfortable living. Time to wake her up. Time to remember who she really was. She went back inside and began to plan. Tansy spent the rest of that day reading through Hollis's letters in chronological order, watching his life unfold year by year in careful script. The first year's letters were hopeful, almost cheerful, updates about the property, but his work as a carpenter in the valley, about mutual acquaintances who asked after her. By the second year, a note of longing had crept in, though he never stated it directly. "I walked up to the overlook today," one letter read. "Remembered the time you shot that 6-point buck at 300 yards. Dad said it was luck. I knew better. The letters continued like that for years, patient, faithful, never demanding. He wrote about his father's declining health, about taking over more of Garrett's care. Dad doesn't admit it, but he's slowing down. Won't use the cane I made him. Stubborn as granite, just like always." The letter dated the month of Garrett's death was different. Hollis's handwriting was shakier, the words more raw. "Dad's gone. They're calling it an accident, but I don't believe it. He was too careful, knew those rocks too well. I found signs of a struggle, scuff marks, disturbed snow where it shouldn't have been. The sheriff says I'm seeing what I want to see, that grief makes us doubt. But I know, Tansy, I know. After that, the letters took on a new purpose. Hollis stopped writing about his daily life and started documenting his investigation. He'd compiled records of Vernon Hess's land dealings, found patterns of properties mysteriously changing hands after accidents or sudden deaths. He'd interviewed old-timers who remembered Vernon from his claim-jumping days, gathered testimony that was decades old but still damning. Vernon's gotten smarter over the years, one letter explained. Uses shell companies now, lawyers who know how to work the system. But he's still the same man, someone who sees valuable land and takes it, regardless of who gets hurt. Among the letters, Tansy found a hand-drawn map. It was beautifully detailed, showing the property boundaries, the creek, the cabin, and various landmarks. But scattered across it were notations in Hollis's hand. First deer kill, winter 95, where Dad taught you to track, summer camp 96. He'd marked places that were significant to her, places she'd almost forgotten. The meadow where she'd learned to identify edible plants. The spring where she'd bathed in summer, the water so cold it made her gasp. The rocky outcrop where she'd sat on clear nights, watching stars spread across the sky like spilled salt. But there were other marks too, ones that made her lean closer to study them. Small X's with dates beside them, concentrated in one area of the property. Survey stakes found, read one notation. Removed, June 2003. Another, fresh digging, August 2007, filled in. Vernon or his people had been coming onto the property for years, searching for something, probably trying to determine the exact location of the mineral deposits. Hollis had been chasing them off, filling in their test holes, removing their markers. A quiet war fought over decades, and she'd known nothing about it. A knock on the cabin door made her jump, her hand going automatically to the pistol at her hip. She approached carefully, angling to see out the window. Relief flooded her when she recognized Virgil Haynes's battered Jeep parked in the clearing. Virgil was 75 if he was a day, his face weathered as old bark, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. He ran the general store in Belmont, had been there since before Tansy first arrived. He'd extended her credit that first hard winter, never mentioned it again after she'd paid him back. Saw smoke from the chimney, he said when she opened the door. Figured you might need supplies. He carried 2 canvas bags, which he set on the table without ceremony. Fresh bread, coffee, canned goods, matches, a bottle of whiskey. Practical things chosen by someone who understood mountain living. Thank you, Virgil. You didn't have to come all the way up here. Didn't have to. Wanted to. He looked around the cabin, his gaze landing on the open crates, the scattered letters. Heard you inherited the place. Heard about Hollis, too. Sorry for your loss. I didn't even know he was gone until yesterday. Virgil nodded slowly. He kept to himself these last years. Good man, though. Quiet but good. Used to come into the store regular, always asking if I'd heard from you. He paused, measuring his words. He never stopped hoping you'd come back. The weight of that settled on her shoulders like snow. I should have. Should have at least written. Can't change the past. Can only work with what we've got now. Virgil's eyes moved to the documents spread across the table. You finding anything interesting in all that? Tansy hesitated, then decided trust had to start somewhere. She showed him Hollis's letters, the photographs of Vernon Hess, the survey reports. Virgil studied them carefully, his expression growing darker. Vernon Hess, now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. Thought maybe he died or moved on? You know him? Everyone around here knows of him. Not many know him personally. He doesn't live in these parts anymore, but his reputation lingers. Back in the 70s and 80s, he worked every angle there was. Claim jumping, forged documents, suspicious accidents. Nothing ever stuck to him legally, but people knew. And now he's respectable. Virgil's tone made it clear what he thought of that respectability. Runs his operations through some development company. Pinnacle Land something. Been buying up mountain properties, turning them into vacation resorts or mineral leases. Makes a fortune and stays clean because he's got lawyers doing the dirty work. Tansy felt her jaw tighten. He's still operating? More than ever. Got big plans for this whole region from what I hear. Wants to buy up all the old homesteads, consolidate the parcels. Virgil looked at her steadily. Your property would be right in the middle of that. She showed him the map with Hollis's notations. He's been coming onto the land for years, looking for the mineral deposits. Doesn't surprise me. Vernon never could let go of something he wanted. Patient, though, I'll give him that. Some men would have given up after 3 decades. Not Vernon. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 30 years of predatory patience pressing down on them. Finally, Virgil spoke again. You planning to fight him? I'm planning to find out what really happened to Garrett. And if Vernon had anything to do with it, then yes, I'm going to fight him. Virgil studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod. You'll need help. Vernon's got resources, got connections, but he doesn't know these mountains like we do. Doesn't have roots here like we do. We? You think you're the only one who owes Garrett Brennan. That old man helped half the people in this valley at one time or another. Never asked for anything back, never kept score. People remember that. He stood, gathering his coat. I'll ask around quiet-like, see what I can find out about Vernon's current operations, who he's got working for him. Virgil, be careful. If Hollis was right about what Vernon did, I didn't survive 75 years by being reckless. But I didn't survive by backing down either. He paused at the door. Garrett would be proud of you coming back like this. Hollis, too. They both loved you, you know. In their way, after he left, Tansy returned to the letters. She read through the night again, piecing together the full picture of Hollis's investigation. He'd been meticulous, patient, gathering evidence bit by bit. But he'd also been alone, fighting a battle he knew he might never win. She wouldn't make that mistake. Virgil was right. She needed allies, needed people who understood what was at stake. But first, she needed to understand the full extent of what Garrett had hidden. The compass coordinates called to her, promising answers buried in the mountain itself. Tomorrow she would follow them. Tonight she would prepare. The mountains had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was this: patience and preparation won more battles than speed and fury. She cleaned Garrett's rifle, checked her own pistol, sharpened both knives. She studied the map until she had every detail memorized, planned her route to the coordinates. And as she worked, she felt the mountain woman she'd been waking up fully, shaking off 30 years of comfortable sleep. Vernon Hesse had waited 3 decades. He could wait a little longer while she got ready to finish this. The morning came cold and clear, frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. Tansy woke at dawn, her body remembering the rhythm of mountain mornings, even after 3 decades. She made coffee strong and black, ate a simple breakfast of bread and cheese from Virgil's supplies, and prepared for the hike. The coordinates from Garrett's compass would take her to the northeastern section of the property, a steep climb through dense pine forest to a ridge overlooking the valley. She'd been there once before, years ago, hunting elk with Garrett. It was rough terrain, the kind that tested your endurance and rewarded your effort with views that made your heart ache. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool pants, a flannel shirt, her old leather jacket. The weight of it felt right, like putting on armor. Garrett's knife at her belt, the pistol at her hip, the compass around her neck. She felt more herself than she had in years. The property line was marked with old fence posts, weathered and leaning but still standing. As she passed the 3rd post, something caught her eye, a fresh surveyor's stake, bright orange plastic gleaming against the brown earth. She crouched beside it, examining the markings. A logo she didn't recognize, PLD with a mountain peak symbol, Pinnacle Land Development. Vernon's company. She pulled the stake from the ground and snapped it in half. A small gesture but satisfying. Then she noticed another stake 50 yards away, and another beyond that. Someone had been surveying the property recently. Very recently. The disturbed earth around the stakes was still fresh. Anger burned cold in her chest. This was her land now, legally hers. Vernon had no right to be here, no right to mark it like he owned it. She moved methodically along the line, pulling up every stake she found, breaking them and tossing the pieces into the brush. She'd removed 7 when she heard the truck. The sound carried clearly in the mountain stillness. an engine straining on the old logging road, getting closer. Tansy moved quickly to higher ground, finding cover behind a jumble of boulders where she could watch the road below. Her hand rested on the pistol grip, ready but not drawn. Two men emerged from a newer model pickup, both wearing surveyor's vests and carrying equipment. They were young, probably in their 30s, with the soft look of men who spent more time in offices than outdoors. They didn't move like they belonged here. They set up a transit at the property line, one man peering through the scope while the other took notes. Tansy watched for several minutes, memorizing their faces, their movements, the way they marked coordinates on a handheld GPS unit. Then she stood up and walked down to meet them. They didn't see her until she was 20 feet away, and when they did, both men startled badly. The one behind the transit actually reached for something at his belt, probably pepper spray, judging by the canister size. "Morning, gentlemen." Tansy kept her voice level, her hands visible. "You're on private property." The note-taker recovered first, forcing a professional smile. "Morning, ma'am. We're just doing some routine surveying for Pinnacle Land Development. I saw your stakes." She gestured back toward the tree line. "The ones I pulled up and broke." The smile faltered. "Ma'am, those are expensive equipment. You can't just, this is my land. I can do whatever I want with things that don't belong here." She let that sink in for a moment. "Who authorized you to survey this property?" The two men exchanged glances. The one with the transit spoke this time. "We have a work order from our company. We were told the property owner had agreed to a survey in preparation for sale negotiations. Well, the property owner is standing right here, and I agreed to no such thing." Tansy moved closer, watching them tense. "Good, they should be nervous. Who signed your work order?" "Our manager. He deals directly with Mr. Hess." There it was. Vernon's name connected directly to this trespass. "Vernon Hess has no authority over this land. Never has, never will. You tell your manager that if anyone from Pinnacle sets foot on this property again without written permission from me, I'll have them arrested for trespassing." "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion. We have documentation that shows I don't care what documentation you think you have. The deed is in my name as of 3 days ago. This land belonged to Garrett Brennan, then Hollis Brennan, and now it belongs to me. Tansy Greer, remember that name." She watched them pack up their equipment with gratifying haste. The note-taker paused before getting in the truck. "We're just doing our jobs, ma'am. Mr. Hess is going to want to talk to you." "I imagine he will. He knows where to find me." They drove away, throwing up dust and gravel. Tansy watched until the sound of the engine faded completely, then sat down on one of the boulders and let out a long breath. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of confrontation. It had been a long time since she'd had to assert herself that way, but it felt good, felt right. This was her land, her fight. She wasn't going to let Vernon Hess or anyone else push her around. She continued her hike, climbing higher into the property. The coordinates led her to a section she barely remembered, a steep slope studded with granite outcrops and twisted pines. She had to use her hands in places, pulling herself up by roots and rock, her breath coming hard in the thin air. Finally, at the top of the ridge, she found what she was looking for. A massive old pine, its trunk easily 6 feet across, marked with 3 deep cuts in the bark. Garrett's mark. She remembered him explaining it once. "Old trapper sign," he'd said. "Means something important buried here." The ground beneath the tree was rocky, covered with pine needles and forest debris. She cleared it away carefully, using a stick to probe the soil. About 2 feet down, her stick hit something solid. She dug with her hands, uncovering a metal box roughly the size of a tackle box. It was rusted but intact, sealed with a heavy padlock. She tried Garrett's knife in the lock, working it carefully until something clicked and the lock fell away. Inside the box, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas, were documents. The original deed to the property, dating back over 100 years, showing the Brennan family's claim, mineral rights documentation properly filed and notarized, and most importantly, a legal brief prepared by a lawyer named Harrison Webb, dated just weeks before Garrett's death. Tansy read it carefully. Her legal knowledge limited but sufficient to understand the basics. Webb had been building a case against Vernon Hesse, documenting his pattern of fraud and intimidation. The brief outlined multiple instances where Vernon had used forged documents to claim mineral rights on properties he didn't own. At the bottom of the brief was a note in Garrett's handwriting. "Meeting with sheriff tomorrow. Finally got enough to put Vernon away. This ends." But Garrett had never made it to that meeting. He died the night before, and the evidence had died with him. Or so Vernon must have thought. Tansy sat back on her heels, pieces falling into place. Vernon had known about the meeting, had known Garrett was finally going to bring charges. So he'd acted first, eliminating the threat in a way that looked like an accident. It was all speculation, impossible to prove after 30 years. But combined with Hollis's evidence, with the pattern of Vernon's behavior, it painted a clear picture. Clear enough, maybe, to make something happen. She repacked the box carefully and began the hike back down. The sun was past its peak, shadows lengthening across the valley. She needed to get back to the cabin, needed to study these documents properly, needed to figure out her next move. But she knew one thing with certainty: Vernon Hesse would come. She'd thrown down the challenge by confronting his surveyors, by asserting her ownership. He would come to deal with her just as he'd dealt with Garrett. The difference was she'd be ready. She'd spent 3 decades learning to track, to wait, to read terrain and anticipate movement. Vernon thought he was hunting her, but he was wrong. The hunter had come home, and she knew these mountains better than he ever would. Sheriff Boone Macklin arrived at the cabin 2 days later, his patrol SUV laboring up the old logging road. Tansy had been expecting him. Word traveled fast in the mountains, and her confrontation with Vernon's surveyors would have reached official ears quickly. She met him on the porch, coffee pot in hand. "Come to arrest me for vandalism, Boone?" He climbed out slowly, his knees clearly bothering him. They were the same age, but where the mountains had kept her lean and hard, desk work had softened him around the middle. Still, his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Came to hear your side before anyone files complaints." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "You really snapped those surveyor stakes in half?" "Everyone I found. They were on my property without permission. Pinnacle saying they have documentation showing Hollis agreed to a pre-sale survey. Then they're lying." She showed him the deed, showed him the dates. "Property transferred to me 3 days ago. Any agreement Hollis might have made died with him. And I'm betting there was no agreement anyway." Boone studied the deed, then pulled out a folder from his vehicle. "Funny thing, I did some checking. Pinnacle filed paperwork 6 months ago claiming they had a verbal agreement with Hollis Brennan to purchase the property upon certain conditions being met. 6 months ago? That would have been right around when Hollis died. Convenient timing." Boone's expression was carefully neutral, but she could read the skepticism there. "Can't prove it's fraudulent without Hollis here to testify he never made such an agreement. But you don't believe it's legitimate. I believe Vernon Hesse has made a career out of documentation. That's technically legal, but ethically rotten." He sipped his coffee. "But belief isn't evidence. And 30 years ago, when I was just a deputy, I learned that lesson the hard way. Tansy understood. Garrett's death. I was one of the first responders. Found him at the base of that cliff. Looked like a straightforward fall. But something felt wrong about it. The positioning of the body, some marks on the rocks that didn't quite fit." He stared out at the mountains. "I pushed for a deeper investigation. My sergeant shut me down hard. Said I was seeing conspiracy where there was just tragedy. When I kept pushing, I nearly lost my job." "You suspected Vernon even then." "Vernon had motive. Everyone knew about the mineral deposits by that point, at least the old-timers did. And he'd been sniffing around Garrett's property for months. But suspicion isn't proof, and I was too young and too inexperienced to know how to get the proof I needed." He turned to her. "I've regretted that for 30 years. Hollis knew it too. Used to come to my office sometimes, just to sit and talk about his investigation. I helped where I could quietly, but it was never enough." She showed him the documents from Garrett's cache, the legal brief, the meeting notes, the evidence of Vernon's pattern of fraud. He read through them carefully, his expression growing darker. This is good. This is very good, but it's also 30 years old. Statute of limitations has long passed on most of this. What about murder? No statute on murder. But proving it after 3 decades would be nearly impossible. All the physical evidence is gone. Most witnesses are dead or too old to be reliable. And Vernon's gotten smarter, uses layers of corporate protection, hires people to do his dirty work. Tansy felt frustration building, but kept her voice level. So he just gets away with it. I didn't say that. Boone set down his coffee cup. I said proving the old murder would be hard. But if we can prove current fraud, forged documents, trespassing with intent to intimidate, that might be enough to shake something loose. And if Vernon thinks he's about to get caught for current crimes, he might make mistakes about the past. What do you need from me? Keep gathering evidence. Document every contact with Pinnacle or anyone connected to Vernon. If they trespass again, call me immediately. I want to catch them in the act. And be careful, Tansy. Vernon's patient, but he's also ruthless. He's waited 30 years for this land. He won't give up easy. After Boone left, Tansy returned to studying Hollis's records. She organized them chronologically, creating a timeline of Vernon's activities over 3 decades. The pattern was clear. He'd tried legal channels first, filing claims that were rejected due to Garrett's properly documented mineral rights. Then he'd tried purchasing the land, offering amounts that started reasonable and escalated to desperate. When that failed, he turned to intimidation, and eventually, she believed, to murder. After Garrett's death, Vernon had shifted tactics again. He'd tied up the property in legal disputes, using shell companies to file overlapping claims. Hollis had spent years fighting these challenges, winning each time, but at the cost of legal fees and endless stress. Vernon was playing a war of attrition, waiting for Hollis to give up or die, and Hollis had died. The question was whether that death had been as natural as it appeared. Tansy found the medical examiner's report in Hollis's files. He'd requested a copy, probably for his own peace of mind. Heart attack, the report said. Acute myocardial infarction, no suspicious circumstances. But Hollis had been only 70, had been healthy, had no history of heart problems. She couldn't prove anything, but she added it to the list of questions that needed answers. 3 days after the confrontation with the surveyors, a lawyer arrived at the cabin. He drove a Mercedes SUV, inappropriately shiny for mountain roads, and wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Tansy watched him struggle up the path in dress shoes, noted his labored breathing, his discomfort with the wilderness. Miss Greer, he stopped several feet away, breathing hard. My name is Martin Kellerman. I represent Pinnacle Land Development, and Vernon Hess. Something flickered in his expression, surprise that she knew the name. Mr. Hess is CEO of Pinnacle, yes. I'm here to discuss a resolution to what appears to be a misunderstanding regarding this property. There's no misunderstanding. This is my land. Your people need to stay off it. Yes, well, he pulled a leather folder from his briefcase. We believe there was an agreement between Mr. Hollis Brennan and Pinnacle for eventual sale of this property. While we understand that agreement didn't transfer to you automatically, we'd like to make you a very generous offer to honor the spirit of that agreement. He showed her a number. It was substantial, easily 10 times what the property would be worth as raw land. More than she'd make in 5 years of guiding. Not interested. Kellerman's professional smile tightened. Miss Greer, I don't think you understand. This property is landlocked on 3 sides by land Pinnacle has already acquired. The only access road crosses our property now. We could make life quite difficult for you. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining reality. We can block your access legally. You'd have to helicopter in supplies. The cost alone would be prohibitive. Tansy studied him, seeing not a powerful lawyer but a man uncomfortable in the wilderness, a man out of his element. The road you're talking about is a public right-of-way, established over 100 years ago. It's documented in the original land grants. You try to block it, I'll sue you and I'll win. Your turn to face legal fees and stress. His smile vanished. You're making a mistake. Mr. Hess is not a man who gives up. Neither am I. Tell Vernon that if he wants to talk to me, he can come himself. No more lawyers, no more surveyors. Him and me, face to face. Otherwise, he can go to hell. Kellerman left angry, his SUV throwing gravel as he accelerated down the mountain. Tansy watched him go, feeling no satisfaction. She'd drawn a line, made her position clear. Now Vernon would have to decide how far he was willing to go. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Garrett, about that cliff, about what his last moments must have been like. Had he known Vernon was going to kill him? Had he tried to fight back? Or had it happened so fast he'd had no time to understand what was happening? She thought about Hollis too, spending 30 years alone, fighting a battle he knew he'd probably never win, doing it anyway because it was right. Because he'd loved his father. Because he'd loved her in his quiet way. She owed them both. Owed them justice, owed them closure, owed them someone who would finish the fight. Dawn found her on the porch, Garrett's rifle across her knees, watching the tree line for movement. She wouldn't be caught by surprise. Vernon was coming. One way or another, he was coming. And when he did, she'd be ready. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow. Winter was coming, and with it, the final reckoning. The geology report arrived in the mail a week later, forwarded from an address in Denver. Tansy studied the return label. A private investigation firm. Inside was a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Hollis Brennan contracted our services 2 years ago to verify original assay results, sending final report as per his instructions should anything happen to him. The report was thorough, modern, utilizing technology that hadn't existed 30 years ago. It confirmed Garrett's original findings and added new details. The rare earth deposits were more extensive than initially believed, potentially worth tens of millions of dollars at current market rates. The report included detailed maps showing the mineral concentrations, geological surveys, and even projections for extraction costs and environmental impact. Vernon had been after a fortune. Garrett had died protecting it, not because he wanted the money, but because he'd known what mining would do to the land. Hollis had continued that protection, understanding his father's values. Now that responsibility fell to Tansy. She spread the maps across the table, comparing them to Hollis's notations of where Vernon's people had been digging and surveying. Vernon knew roughly where the deposits were, probably had his own surveys done over the years, but he needed legal access to act on that knowledge. Access that required owning the land. A sound outside made her freeze. Not an animal, she knew those sounds. This was mechanical, distant, but approaching. She moved to the window, staying back in the shadows. A UTV was coming up the trail, too narrow for trucks, but perfect for the rough terrain. 3 men rode in it, and even from a distance she could tell they weren't tourists. They moved with purpose, stopping periodically to examine the ground, looking for something. Or someone. Tansy grabbed her rifle and slipped out the back, moving into the forest with practiced silence. She'd scouted this area thoroughly over the past week, knew every path and hiding spot. She positioned herself where she could watch them without being seen. The men split up, one staying with the UTV, while the other 2 approached the cabin. They weren't trying to hide their presence, knocked loudly on the door, called out her name. When she didn't answer, they tried the handle, locked. She'd made sure of that. One of them produced a tool and worked the lock. It took him less than a minute. They went inside. Tansy counted to 30, giving them time to commit to the trespass. Then she moved. She came at them from the side, rifle raised, using the cabin wall for cover. Come out slow with your hands where I can see them. Commotion inside. Then the 2 men emerged, hands raised, but expressions more annoyed than frightened. They were professionals. Private security or something similar. Well-dressed for mountain work, equipped with radios and what looked like tactical gear under their jackets. Ma'am, we're just looking for... You're trespassing. Broke into my home. That's burglary under state law. The 3rd man approached from the UTV, also with his hands up, but his body language was different. Confident. In charge. Miss Greer, I apologize for the intrusion. We were concerned for your safety. You haven't been answering communications. I don't recall giving anyone permission to communicate with me. or to check on my safety, or to break into my home. We represent a security consulting firm contracted by Pinnacle. There's been some confusion about property boundaries, and we wanted to ensure, spare me the speech. You're here because Vernon Hess sent you. Now you're going to leave, and you're going to tell him that next time anyone trespasses on my property, I'm not calling the sheriff first. I'm defending my home, and Montana law is very clear about my right to do that. The leader studied her for a long moment, reassessing. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't a 62-year-old woman holding a rifle like she knew how to use it. Understood. We'll relay your message. They moved back toward the UTV slowly. But Miss Greer, this land dispute is going to be resolved one way or another. Mr. Hess has been more than patient. He's prepared to go to court if necessary. Let him. I'll see him there. After they left, Tansy's hands started shaking. She went inside, locked the door, and did a quick inventory. They'd been through her things, but carefully. Nothing obviously disturbed, nothing stolen. Looking for the documents, probably. Hollis's evidence. Good thing she'd hidden the most important materials in the root cellar, wrapped in waterproof containers and buried under sacks of potatoes. She called Boone on the satellite phone she'd purchased in town. They came. 3 men broke into the cabin. I've got them on video. She'd set up trail cameras around the property, borrowed from her guiding business. Don't delete that footage. I'll be up tomorrow with the deputy. We'll file formal charges. Will it stick? A pause. Probably not. They'll claim they were checking on uninhabited property, didn't know anyone was living there. But it'll create a record, show a pattern of harassment. Keep building the case. That night, Tansy couldn't shake the feeling of violation. The cabin had always been her sanctuary, even in memory. Having strangers pore through her things, touching Hollis's letters, standing where Garrett had stood, it made her skin crawl. But it also hardened her resolve. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting the only place she'd ever truly belonged. She spent the next 3 days fortifying. Not in ways Vernon's men would recognize, no bars on windows or obvious defenses. Instead, she worked the way Garrett had taught her, using the land itself. She memorized every approach to the cabin, set up early warning systems using fishing line and bells in places only she would know to look. She cleared fields of fire from defensive positions, created fallback routes through the forest. She cached supplies in hidden locations, food, water, ammunition, first aid. If Vernon wanted to make this a siege, she'd be ready. Virgil visited again, bringing news from town. Word is Vernon's in Belmont, staying at the Grand Hotel. Been meeting with local politicians, making donations to their campaigns. Laying groundwork. For what? Eminent domain, maybe. If he can get the county to declare your property necessary for some public project, the mineral deposits aren't in the public interest. No, but a road might be, or a utility easement. Vernon's good at framing things to sound reasonable. Virgil set down a box of supplies. There's something else. That lawyer who came to see you? Kellerman? He's been asking around about you. Your history, your finances, looking for leverage. He won't find much. I live simply, don't owe anyone. That's what makes you dangerous to them. They can't pressure you economically, can't threaten your lifestyle because you don't have one they can touch. Virgil smiled grimly. Vernon's used to dealing with people who have something to lose. You've already lost everything that mattered and built yourself back up. Makes you immune to the usual tactics. After Virgil left, Tansy sat on the porch and thought about that. It was true. She'd walked away from comfort, from security, from the expectations of normal life. She'd chosen hardship and freedom over ease and constraint. That choice had cost her relationships, stability, the chance at a conventional family, but it had also made her strong. Made her someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. Vernon was about to learn that some people couldn't be moved, that some ground couldn't be taken without a fight. That the woman he'd dismissed as an aging mountain recluse was actually the most dangerous kind of opponent, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She cleaned her rifle again. Though it didn't need it, the ritual was soothing, familiar. Garrett had taught her gun maintenance in this very cabin, sitting at this same table, his rough hands guiding hers. gun's like anything else worth keeping," he'd said. "You take care of it, it'll take care of you. Neglect it, and it'll fail when you need it most." She wasn't going to neglect anything, not the rifle, not the land, not the memory of the men who died protecting it. The wind picked up outside, bringing the first real cold of the season. Snow before morning, her bones told her. She'd need to bring in more wood, check the stove, prepare for the storm. But storms passed. They always did. And when this one was over, she'd still be here, standing on ground that belonged to her by right and by blood. Let Vernon come. Let him bring lawyers and hired men and all the power money could buy. She had something better. She had home field advantage, 30 years of mountain wisdom, and the kind of determination that only came from having already survived the worst life could throw at you. She'd faced down winter with nothing but a rifle and stubbornness. Vernon Hesse would be easier than that. The storm lasted 3 days, dumping 18 inches of snow and making the mountain roads impassable. Tansy was prepared. She had supplies, fuel for the stove, and the kind of patience that comes from years of waiting out mountain weather. She used the time to go through every document Hollis had left, organizing them into categories: evidence of Vernon's fraud, documentation of mineral rights, correspondence with lawyers. On the 3rd day, as the storm finally cleared, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a legal document tucked into the back of one of Hollis's ledgers, easy to miss among the financial records. A sale agreement for mineral rights dated 33 years ago, signed by her mother, Helen Greer. Tansy read it 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her chest, like stones into cold water. Her mother had sold the mineral rights to the property, not to Vernon directly, but to a company called Mountain Resources LLC, for $20,000, a sum that would have seemed enormous to a woman with gambling debts and no prospects. But the rights hadn't been her mother's to sell. The property had belonged to Garrett, with Tansy listed as a secondary claimant due to her residence there. Her mother had no legal authority to sell anything, yet she'd signed the paperwork, and someone had notarized it. Tansy's hands shook as she dug deeper into the box. There were more documents, legal challenges filed by Garrett after he discovered the sale, handwriting analysis showing the signature was genuine, testimony from witnesses who confirmed Helen Greer had signed willingly, believing she had the right, and at the bottom, a letter from a lawyer to Garrett, dated 2 weeks before his death. Mr. Brennan, while the sale was fraudulent due to Mrs. Greer lacking authority, the situation is complicated by the fact that she genuinely believed she had the right to sell. The buyer, Mountain Resources LLC, appears to be a shell company, but tracking the actual owners has proven difficult. They've been careful to layer their corporate structure. However, I've found connections suggesting Vernon Hesse is the ultimate owner. He'd likely manipulated Mrs. Greer into signing, knowing the sale was invalid, but hoping it would create enough legal confusion to cloud the title. We have a strong case, but it will require testimony from Mrs. Greer herself to prove fraud. I understand she's estranged from her daughter and may be difficult to locate. Tansy felt sick. Her mother, the woman she'd fled from, the woman who'd tried to control every aspect of her life, had been manipulated by Vernon, used as a tool to steal something that didn't belong to her. She'd never known. Helen had died 15 years ago, alone in a nursing home in Denver, and Tansy hadn't gone to the funeral. They hadn't spoken in over 20 years, the wound between them too deep to bridge. And now she'd never know why her mother had done it, whether she'd understood the damage she was causing. There was more. Tansy kept reading, finding layers she hadn't anticipated. Her mother had contacted Garrett after signing the papers, had tried to explain. The correspondence was brief, Garrett's anger evident even in his terse replies. But in her mother's letters, Tansy saw something she'd never expected: remorse. "I thought it was my right," her mother had written. "The property was in the family, and I needed the money desperately. The men from the company said it was just mineral rights, that it wouldn't affect your living there. I didn't understand what I was signing away. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. They've threatened to sue me if I recant. I'm sorry, Garrett. Tell Tansy I'm sorry. Garrett had never told her. Had kept this knowledge to himself, probably to protect her from the pain of her mother's betrayal. And then he died before he could resolve it. Hollis had discovered the truth while going through his father's papers. The maintenance log showed his investigation, tracking down Mountain Resources LLC, connecting it to Vernon, finding the evidence that Vernon had specifically targeted Helen because of her strained relationship with Tansy and her financial desperation. Vernon had weaponized her mother's weakness, had used family dysfunction as a tool to cloud property rights. It was brilliant in a terrible way. Even with Garrett's proper documentation, the sale created enough legal ambiguity to tie up the property in courts for years. And there was one more revelation. Tansy found it in a folder marked Police Reports Supplemental. It was a report filed by a deputy she didn't recognize, dated 2 days after Garrett's death. An interview with Vernon Hess. Vernon had been on the property the day Garrett died. He admitted to it, claimed he'd been trying to negotiate one final time, that Garrett had refused to meet with him, that he'd left before anything happened. The deputy's notes indicated Vernon had an alibi for the estimated time of death, a gas station receipt from 50 miles away, timed just hours after he claimed to have left the property, but there was a note in the margin. Handwritten, "Receipt doesn't prove he was driving. Could have had someone else make the purchase." Someone, probably the young deputy Boone Macklin, had suspected the alibi was manufactured. But with no other evidence, no witnesses, nothing concrete, the investigation had gone nowhere. Tansy sat back. The documents scattered around her like pieces of a puzzle that finally revealed its full picture. Vernon hadn't just wanted the land. He'd orchestrated a complex scheme, manipulate Helen into signing fraudulent papers, use those papers to cloud the title, and when Garrett got too close to exposing the fraud, eliminate him in a way that looked accidental. Then he'd played the long game, waiting for Hollis to give up or die, using the legal confusion Helen's signature had created to justify his continued claims to the property. He'd been patient, methodical, willing to wait decades for the payoff, and it had almost worked. If Hollis hadn't been equally patient, equally determined, equally willing to spend his entire life protecting what his father had built, Vernon would have succeeded. But there was something else in the documents, something that changed everything. A handwriting analysis report dated just 6 months ago, right before Hollis's death. The expert had compared Helen's signature on the mineral rights sale to other documents she'd signed. The conclusion was unambiguous. While the signature appeared to be Helen's, there were microscopic differences, suggesting it had been traced or forged by someone with access to her genuine signatures. Helen hadn't signed the document after all. She'd been convinced she had, probably shown a different document to sign, but the actual sale agreement bore a forgery. Vernon hadn't just manipulated her. He'd outright forged her signature, then convinced her she'd signed willingly, knowing that her guilt and shame would keep her from looking too closely at the truth. Tansy felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. Anger at Vernon, certainly, but also something unexpected, a strange, painful compassion for her mother. Helen had died believing she'd betrayed her daughter, had spent her final years carrying that guilt. And it had all been a lie. She found her mother's last letter to Garrett, dated a year after the sale. "I can't undo what I did, but please tell Tansy that everything I did I thought was within my rights. I never meant to hurt her. I just needed the money so badly. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I loved her, even if I was terrible at showing it." Garrett had kept the letter. Had he meant to show it to Tansy someday? She'd never know. She sat in the quiet cabin, surrounded by evidence of decades of deception and pain, and felt the full weight of what Vernon had done. He hadn't just stolen land. He'd poisoned relationships, destroyed families, killed a good man, and let another die in isolation and grief, and he'd nearly gotten away with it. Tansy gathered the documents carefully, her hands steady now. This was more than she'd hoped for. Concrete evidence of forgery, of Vernon's presence on the property when Garrett died, of a pattern of fraud that went back decades. Combined with Hollis's meticulous documentation, it might finally be enough. But she needed one more thing. She needed testimony from someone who'd been there, who'd witnessed Vernon's operations firsthand. And she knew where to find it: Mabel Pritchard. Virgil had mentioned her, Vernon's old bookkeeper, the one who'd kept her own records as insurance. If Mabel was still alive, still sharp enough to testify, she might be the key to everything. Tansy checked her satellite phone. The roads would be clear by tomorrow. She'd go to town, find Mabel, and hear what the woman knew. And then she'd take everything, every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence, and she'd finish what Garrett and Hollis had started. Vernon Hess's 30-year game was about to end, and this time he would lose. Outside, the snow-covered mountain gleamed in the afternoon sun, pristine and beautiful. Somewhere out there, Vernon was planning his next move. Confident in his decades of success, he had no idea that the woman he'd dismissed, whose family he'd destroyed, whose protectors he'd killed, was about to bring everything crashing down around him. Tansy smiled, cold and certain. The hunt was almost over. Time to close the trap. Mabel Pritchard lived in the Belmont Senior Care Center, a modest facility on the edge of town. Tansy arrived unannounced, carrying a box of documents and a recording device she'd purchased at the electronics store. The receptionist was young and uncertain, but when Tansy mentioned she was there about Hollis Brennan, the woman's expression softened. Oh, Mr. Brennan used to visit Miss Mabel every week. She took his death very hard. I'm sure she'd be glad to see a friend of his. Mabel's room was on the second floor, overlooking a small garden, brown with winter. The woman who answered Tansy's knock was in her 80s, rail-thin but sharp-eyed, with white hair cut practically short. Miss Pritchard, my name is Tansy Greer. I know who you are. Mabel's voice was surprisingly strong. Hollis talked about you. Come in, come in. I've been expecting someone like you. The room was small but tidy, decorated with photographs and mementos. Mabel settled into her chair and studied Tansy with the kind of thoroughness that came from a lifetime of reading people and situations. Hollis said, if anything happened to him, someone would come asking questions about Vernon Hess. Looks like he was right. You knew Hollis was in danger? I knew Vernon doesn't let go of things. And Hollis was the last obstacle between Vernon and that property. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. This will take a while. Mabel had worked for Vernon for 15 years, starting in the early 70s, when she was a young bookkeeper fresh out of business school. Vernon was charming back then. Told me he was helping mountain families monetize their properties, creating opportunities. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But gradually she'd seen the truth. The families Vernon helped often ended up with nothing, their land transferred through complicated legal maneuvers they didn't understand. The accidents that befell property owners who refused to sell. The forged documents, the bribed officials, the threats disguised as friendly advice. I kept records of everything. Not because I planned to use them. I was too scared of Vernon. But because I needed to know the truth about what I was part of. When I finally quit, Vernon tried to buy my silence, offered me a small fortune to destroy my records. But you didn't. No, I kept them safe all these years. Told Vernon if anything happened to me, everything would go to the authorities. It's kept me alive this long. She pulled a key from around her neck. This opens a safety deposit box at First Mountain Bank. Box 247, everything's in there, 30 years of records, copies of forged documents, evidence of bribes, witness statements, everything. Tansy felt her heart racing. Why didn't you come forward before? Because I was a coward. Mabel's voice was bitter. I told myself I was being practical, that one person couldn't take down someone like Vernon. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of what he'd do. Scared of losing what little I had. She looked at Tansy directly. But I'm 84 years old. What's Vernon going to do? Kill me? I'm already dying. Cancer. Doctor says 6 months, maybe less. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's clarifying knowing your time's limited. Makes you think about legacy, about what you leave behind. I don't want my legacy to be silence in the face of evil. She handed Tansy the key. Hollis was supposed to get this if I died first. Now it's yours. Use it to finish what he couldn't. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything Mabel remembered. She provided names of witnesses, explained Vernon's corporate structure, detailed the shell companies and false fronts he used to hide his operations. She confirmed that Mountain Resources LLC was one of Vernon's creations, established specifically to purchase mineral rights through fraudulent means, and she dropped one more bombshell. Vernon's son works for him now. Garrett Hess, named after his grandfather, ironically enough. He's the one who handles the difficult properties, the ones where legal methods aren't working. He's smarter than his father, more subtle, and more ruthless. Tansy absorbed this information. Vernon had a son involved in the operation. Another generation carrying on the family business of theft and violence. Will you testify? Tansy asked. In court, if it comes to that. Yes, I'll testify to everything I know. It's the only decent thing I've done in 40 years. Mabel's hands shook slightly. But move fast. I don't know how much time I have, and Vernon has ways of making witnesses disappear. Tansy left with the key, her mind racing with possibilities. She went directly to the bank, presented identification, and accessed the safety deposit box. Inside were ledgers, files, thumb drives, decades of evidence meticulously organized and documented. Mabel hadn't just kept records. She'd created a comprehensive case against Vernon Hess. She took everything to Boone's office. He called in his most trusted deputy, and they spent hours reviewing the material. The evidence was damning. Fraud, forgery, bribery, possibly even conspiracy to commit murder. But building a prosecutable case would take time. We need to move carefully, Boone said. This much evidence, this many potential charges, we can't afford to make mistakes. Vernon will have expensive lawyers. Every piece of evidence needs to be airtight. How long? A week, maybe 2. We need to verify everything, get statements from living witnesses, coordinate with the county prosecutor. Vernon might not wait that long. I know. That's why I'm assigning protection. Deputy Wilson will stake out your property, keep watch for any trespassers. But Tansy shook her head. No, Vernon's smart. If he sees official police presence, he'll know we're building a case. He'll destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, maybe run. I need him to think he still has the upper hand. Tansy, that's too dangerous. I've lived through mountain winters with nothing but a rifle. I can handle Vernon Hess, they argued, but she was adamant. Finally, Boone relented with conditions. You wear a wire. You keep your satellite phone on at all times. And you don't confront him alone. You call for backup immediately if he shows up. She agreed, though she had no intention of waiting for backup if things went wrong. Backup took time. On the mountain, you survived by acting in the moment, not by waiting for help to arrive. Back at the cabin, Tansy prepared. She made copies of the most important documents, hid them in multiple locations on the property. She memorized key facts from Mabel's records. She checked and rechecked her weapons, her emergency supplies, her escape routes. Virgil visited on the 5th day, bringing news. Vernon's back in town. Checked into the Grand Hotel again, brought his son with him. Word is they're planning something. His son, Garrett. That's him. Late 30s, wears suits like armor. Has his father's eyes. Cold. He's been meeting with local contractors, asking about access to your property, about the difficulty of the terrain. Reconnaissance. That's what I figure. They're planning to make a move. Virgil set down supplies. There's something else. A rental truck was seen on the old logging road near your property line. Sheriff's deputy checked it out, said they were bird watchers. But since when do bird watchers need a truck that size? Tansy felt the pieces clicking into place. Vernon wasn't just coming to negotiate or intimidate. He was planning something bigger. The rental truck suggested equipment, maybe personnel. He was done being patient. That night she barely slept. She lay in the darkness, listening to every sound, her rifle within reach. The cabin was silent, except for the wind outside and the settling of old timbers. But something felt wrong, that instinct Garrett had taught her to trust, the sense that predators were near. At 3 in the morning she heard it. A sound that didn't belong, the soft crunch of snow under careful feet. She was up instantly, moving to the window. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of movement. Multiple people, approaching with the caution of men who knew they were trespassing. She counted at least 4, maybe more. They weren't making a direct approach, instead spreading out to surround the cabin. Professional tactics. Vernon's son was leading them. She recognized his silhouette from descriptions, the way he moved with military precision. Tansy grabbed her satellite phone and texted Boone. "They're here!" Multiple hostiles. "Don't announce arrival." Then she prepared. This was what she'd been training for. What all those years in the mountains had prepared her for. Not hunting animals, but defending ground that was hers by right and by blood. She didn't want violence. But if Vernon forced her hand, she'd respond the way Garrett had taught her, with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. The men reached the clearing. Through the window she could see them better now. 5 total, all wearing dark clothing, all carrying equipment. Not weapons she could see, but tools. Crowbars, a portable drill, what looked like surveying equipment. They were going to break in. Search the place, maybe plant something, establish some kind of legal pretext for claiming the property. And if she was there alone in the middle of the night, who would believe her version of events? Tansy moved to the door and opened it, standing in the threshold with her rifle clearly visible but pointed at the ground. "That's far enough, gentlemen." They froze. Garrett Hess stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. "Miss Greer, we're not here to cause trouble. We have a court order allowing us to survey at 3 in the morning with crowbars." "Try again." His smile was cold, calculated. "We were told the property was unoccupied. We didn't want to disturb anyone during normal business hours. The property is occupied by me, and you're trespassing. Leave now, or I'll defend my home under Montana law." "Miss Greer, I don't think you understand the situation. This property is subject to multiple claims." "There are no multiple claims. The deed is in my name, free and clear. Your father's fraudulent documents don't change that." Something shifted in his expression. "Be very careful about making accusations like that. They're not accusations. They're facts. Facts supported by 30 years of evidence that I'll be presenting to the county prosecutor. Your father forged my mother's signature. He murdered Garrett Brennan, and he spent 3 decades stealing from families too scared to fight back." "That ends now." The men behind Garrett Hess stirred, hands moving toward their belts. Tansy raised her rifle, not aiming but ready. "I'm wearing a wire." "The sheriff has been notified. Every word you say is being recorded. So before you do something stupid, think about whether you want to add assault or attempted murder to the charges you're already facing." For a long moment, nobody moved. The mountain wind whispered through the trees, cold and knowing. Then sirens sounded in the distance, Boone arriving with backup. Garrett Hess smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." He and his men retreated to the tree line just as Boone's vehicles arrived, lights flashing blue and red across the snow. The final confrontation was coming, but tonight Tansy had won the first real battle. She lowered her rifle and watched them disappear into the forest, knowing that Vernon would come next. The son had failed. Now the father would try, and she'd be ready. Vernon Hess arrived at dawn, alone. Tansy watched him from the cabin window as his black SUV navigated the logging road, moving slowly, deliberately. He parked 50 yards from the cabin and sat there for several minutes before finally emerging. He was older than she'd expected, 75 at least, his face deeply lined, his hair white but still full. He wore expensive outdoor clothing, the kind that screamed money without trying to look working class. Even from a distance, she could see the confidence in his posture, the sense of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He approached the cabin with his hands visible, carrying nothing but a leather folder. When he was 20 feet away, he stopped and called out, "Miss Greer, may we talk? Just talk." "I'm unarmed." Tansy stepped onto the porch, Garrett's rifle in her hands. "Say what you came to say from there." Vernon smiled, a practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand there's been some tension. My son exceeded his authority last night, and for that I apologize." "He's young, overeager." But his heart is in the right place. His heart is in your wallet, just like yours is. Perhaps. Vernon seemed unruffled. But that doesn't mean we can't resolve this situation amicably. I've come to make you an offer, a real offer, not the preliminary numbers my lawyer threw around. I'm not interested in selling. Please, just hear me out. $1 million cash for the property. You could live anywhere, do anything. You're 62 years old. You've earned the right to an easy retirement. I already have what I want. This land. Vernon's expression hardened slightly. Miss Greer, I've been very patient. More patient than most men would be. But patience has limits. The legal situation with this property is complicated. No, it's not. You forged my mother's signature on fraudulent documents. That's not complicated. That's criminal. For the first time, something like surprise crossed his face. I see you've been busy. I've been thorough. I have Mabel Pritchard's records. I have Hollis's documentation. I have handwriting analysis proving the forgery. And I have testimony connecting you to Garrett Brennan's death. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, the false pleasantness gone, replaced by something colder and more honest. Garrett Brennan was a stubborn old fool. He could have taken my money, could have lived comfortably. Instead, he chose to die on this mountain defending rocks and trees. He didn't choose to die. You killed him. I eliminated an obstacle. In business, sometimes difficult decisions are necessary. Tansy felt ice in her veins. He'd admitted it. Right here, out loud, he'd confessed to murder. She hoped the wire was picking up every word. And Hollis? Was his heart attack natural? Vernon smiled. The beauty of patience, Miss Greer, is that eventually nature does your work for you. Hollis spent 30 years fighting a battle he couldn't win. The stress, the isolation, the constant legal pressure, these things take their toll. His heart simply gave out. You drove him to it. I created circumstances. What people do with those circumstances is their choice. Vernon moved closer, and Tansy raised the rifle slightly. He stopped, hands still visible. But we're getting off track. I didn't come here to reminisce about the past. I came to discuss the future. There's nothing to discuss. I think there is. You have evidence, I don't dispute that. But evidence requires prosecution, which requires political will. And I've spent 30 years building relationships in this county. The prosecutor is a friend. The county commissioners have benefited from my donations. Even your sheriff, as honorable as he tries to be, understands that some battles aren't worth fighting. You think you can make this go away with money and connections? I know I can. I've done it before. Multiple times. He opened the leather folder, showed her documents. These are affidavits from the men who were here last night. They swear they were conducting legal surveys on public land, that you threatened them with a firearm. I have witnesses who will testify that you're unstable, that you've made threats against me. I can bury you in legal proceedings that will cost you everything you have. Or you take the $1 million. You walk away, and we both move on with our lives. Tansy looked at this man who'd killed Garrett, driven Hollis to an early grave, destroyed her mother's peace of mind, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. He was right about one thing. Legal battles could drag on for years, cost everything she had. Men like Vernon were expert at using the system to grind down opposition, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd admitted to murder on a recording that was being transmitted directly to Boone's office. And Boone had deputies stationed out of sight, waiting for a signal. She lowered the rifle slightly. Tell me one thing. Did you know about my mother? That she thought she'd really signed those papers? Vernon shrugged. She signed something. Whether she understood what she was signing, that's immaterial. The sale was invalid anyway. I knew that. But it served its purpose, created enough confusion to justify my claims. She died thinking she'd betrayed her daughter. People die thinking all sorts of things. It's rarely my concern. Tansy felt something break free inside her, not anger, but a cold, clean determination. This man had no remorse, no humanity. He saw people as obstacles or tools, nothing more. She'd given him every chance to show some scrap of decency, some hint that underneath the predator was a human being. He'd shown her exactly who he was. Time to finish this. I'm not taking your money, Vernon. Tansy's voice was steady, final. "And you're not taking this land." Vernon's expression darkened. "Then you're a fool. You think your evidence matters? You think one old woman's testimony and some dusty documents will be enough? I'll tie this up in court for decades. You'll die on this mountain, still fighting. Maybe, but you'll die knowing you lost. Knowing that the one thing you spent your whole life chasing, you never got." Something flickered in Vernon's eyes. Rage, quickly controlled. "You're making a mistake." "No, you made the mistake. 30 years ago when you killed Garrett. 6 months ago when Hollis died fighting you. And this morning when you admitted it all on a recording that's being transmitted to law enforcement." Vernon's face went white, then red. "You're bluffing." Tansy pulled aside her jacket collar, showing the small wire taped to her skin. "Sheriff Macklin has heard everything. Your confession to murder, your admission of fraud, your attempted bribery. He's got deputies surrounding this property right now." For the first time, Vernon looked around, really looked, and saw what she'd seen earlier. Movement in the trees, the glint of sunlight on badges, vehicles positioned on the access roads. He'd walked into a trap. His hand moved toward his pocket. "Don't," Tansy said, raising the rifle. "Whatever you're reaching for, it's not worth it. I'm just getting my phone." Slowly, he pulled out a smartphone, his hands shaking now. Rage or fear, she couldn't tell. But before he could dial, Boone emerged from the tree line. 2 deputies flanking him. "Vernon Hess, you're under arrest for the murder of Garrett Brennan, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted bribery of a witness." Vernon's composure cracked completely. "This is harassment. I'll have your badge, Macklin. You have no evidence. We have your confession. We have 30 years of documented fraud. We have witness testimony." Boone moved closer, handcuffs ready. "And we have justice that's 3 decades overdue. You can't prove anything. Your lawyers can't help you now. Not with Mabel Pritchard's records. Not with handwriting analysis proving you forged documents. Not with you admitting on tape that you eliminated an obstacle." Boone's voice was cold. "You should have left when you had the chance." Vernon turned back to Tansy, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over. Even if they convict me, which they won't, I have resources. I have people. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." "No, Vernon. I'll spend the rest of my life on this mountain, living the way Garrett taught me, free. You're going to spend yours in a cell, knowing that everything you worked for, everything you killed for, it's all gone." As the deputies moved in to cuff him, Vernon lunged, not at them, but at Tansy. It was sudden, desperate, the act of a man with nothing left to lose. His hand went to his pocket, pulled something. Tansy reacted on instinct, the way Garrett had trained her. She stepped aside, used Vernon's momentum against him, brought the rifle stock up in a controlled arc that caught him in the shoulder. He went down hard, whatever he'd been reaching for flying from his hand. It was a knife. Small, easily concealed, but deadly at close range. Boone and his deputies were on him immediately, wrestling him to the ground, securing the cuffs. Vernon fought, screaming threats and curses that echoed across the mountain. Tansy stood back, breathing hard, watching as they hauled him to his feet. Blood ran from his nose where he'd hit the ground. His expensive outdoor clothing was covered in dirt and snow. He looked old suddenly, diminished, stripped of the power and confidence he'd worn like armor. "It's over," she said quietly. "Garrett's vindicated. Hollis's fight is won. And you're finished." They led him away. His son, Garrett Hess, was being arrested separately. Tansy saw deputies bringing him up from the tree line where he'd apparently been waiting. The younger Hess saw his father and something crumbled in his expression. The realization that everything they'd built was collapsing. Virgil appeared from where he'd been watching with a group of townspeople, witnesses Boone had gathered, people who'd known Garrett, who remembered Vernon's crimes, who'd come to see justice finally served. "It's done," Virgil said simply. "Garrett can rest now. Hollis, too." Tansy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She felt hollowed out, exhausted, but also lighter somehow. The weight she'd been carrying, the weight of Garrett's unsolved murder, of Hollis's lonely battle, of her own abandonment of the people who'd loved her, that weight was finally lifting. Boone approached, removing his hat. "We'll need your full statement. And Mabel will need to testify. But with Vernon's confession and the evidence we've gathered, I don't see any way he walks away from this. What about his son? He'll be charged as an accessory. The men he brought last night will testify against him in exchange for lighter sentences. The whole organization is going to collapse. Boone looked at the cabin, at the mountain rising behind it. Garrett would be proud of you. Hollis, too. I just finished what they started. No, you did more than that. You came back when you didn't have to. You fought when it would have been easier to take the money. You honored their memory the best way possible, by not giving up. Tansy watched as they loaded Vernon into a patrol car. He stared at her through the window, still defiant, still refusing to accept defeat. But it didn't matter what he believed. The mountain had its justice now. The land was secure, and the men who died protecting it could finally rest. She turned back to the cabin, to the home Garrett had built, and Hollis had maintained, and she had reclaimed. The sun was rising higher, burning off the morning frost, promising a clear, cold day. For the first time in 30 years, she felt like she'd come home for good. 3 months later, Tansy stood at the overlook where Garrett had died, the place where Vernon had pushed him to his death 3 decades ago. The snow had melted, giving way to early spring. Wildflowers dotted the meadow below, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, its sound carrying on the wind. She'd come to scatter ashes. Vernon had been convicted on all charges: murder, fraud, conspiracy. The trial had been swift, the evidence overwhelming. His lawyers had tried every trick, but with his recorded confession and Mabel Pritchard's devastating testimony, there was no defense. He'd been sentenced to life without parole. In custody, he'd finally looked like what he was, a bitter old man who'd wasted his life chasing wealth at the cost of his humanity. Garrett Hess, Vernon's son, had received 15 years. He'd cooperated, given testimony about his father's operations, helped authorities unravel decades of fraud. Pinnacle Land Development had collapsed, its assets seized, its ill-gotten properties returned to rightful owners or sold to pay restitution. But today wasn't about Vernon or justice or legal victories. Today was about remembrance. Tansy opened the first urn, Hollis's ashes, which she'd claimed from the county. His will had specified cremation, but had said nothing about where to scatter the remains. She believed she knew where he'd want to be. "I'm sorry I left," she said to the wind, to the mountain, to Hollis's memory. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when you needed me. But I'm here now. And I'm going to take care of this place the way you did, the way your father did. It's going to stay wild and free the way it should be." She scattered his ashes over the overlook, watching them catch the wind and spread across the slope. Hollis would be part of the mountain now, part of the land he'd spent his life protecting. The second container held something different, a sapling, a young pine she'd grown from a seed collected on the property. She planted it there at the overlook, between where Garrett's ashes had been scattered years ago and where Hollis's were now joining the earth. The tree would grow slowly, patiently, the way mountains measure time. In 100 years, it would tower over this spot, providing shade and shelter, a living monument to 2 good men who'd valued land over wealth, integrity over comfort. She added soil, watered it from her canteen, and sat back on her heels. "It's done," she said simply. "You can rest now." Back at the cabin, life had settled into a rhythm. She'd quit her guiding business in Belmont, moved to the mountain permanently. The cabin was winterized now, solar panels on the roof providing power, a new well ensuring clean water. She'd made it comfortable without making it soft. It was still a mountain cabin, still required you to earn your place here. Boone visited weekly, checking on her but also just visiting. They'd grown closer through the trial, 2 old friends rediscovering what they'd once meant to each other. Nothing romantic. They were both too old and practical for that kind of complication. But companionship, shared history, the comfort of someone who understood. Virgil came too, bringing supplies and gossip from town. The community had rallied around her during the trial, offering support and testimony. People remembered Garrett fondly, remembered how he'd helped them. That goodwill had extended to her, the woman who'd avenged his death and protected his legacy. Mabel Pritchard had passed away 2 weeks after testifying, the cancer taking her quickly in the end. But she'd lived long enough to see Vernon convicted, long enough to unburden herself of 40 years of complicity. Her last words to Tansy had been simple. "Thank you for letting me help make this right." The cabin was full of memories now. Hollis's letters in a box by the bed, Garrett's rifle mounted over the fireplace, the compass still around her neck. But there were new memories too. Trail cameras she checked weekly, documenting the wildlife that moved through the property. A garden she was planning for the spring, using seeds from a catalogue Virgil had brought. Books borrowed from the library in town, their spines cracked and comfortable. She'd started writing too, not a journal like Garrett's, but letters. Letters to her mother, saying the things she'd never said when Helen was alive. She didn't mail them, there was nowhere to mail them to, but writing them brought a kind of peace. Forgiveness, maybe, or at least understanding. Her mother had been a victim too, manipulated and used by Vernon, dying with guilt for something she hadn't even actually done. Tansy couldn't change the past, couldn't repair their broken relationship. But she could choose not to carry anger anymore, could choose to remember the good things, few though they were, and let the rest go. One evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, Tansy sat on the porch with coffee, watching the mountain turn gold and purple in the fading light. This view, this exact view, was what Garrett had protected, what Hollis had fought for, what she'd nearly lost. She thought about the 2 wooden crates that had started everything. They sat empty now in the root cellar, their contents absorbed into her life, their secrets revealed. Someone had left them knowing she'd return, knowing she'd need the truth they contained. Hollis, probably. Hollis, who'd kept faith for 30 years, who'd believed she'd come back even when she didn't believe it herself. "I'm home," she said to the mountain, to the memories, to the future taking shape around her. "I'm finally home," a raven called from the ridge, harsh, knowing, approving. The wind carried the scent of pine and snowmelt and possibility. Inside the cabin, a fire waited to be lit, dinner waited to be cooked, another peaceful evening waited to unfold. She'd spent 30 years running from this place, building a life that felt safe but incomplete. Now at 62, she'd finally stopped running, had planted herself here as firmly as the sapling on the overlook, ready to grow, to endure, to become part of the landscape. The mountain had reclaimed her, and she'd reclaimed it right back. Some things she'd learned weren't meant to be left behind. Some places called you back no matter how far you ran. And some legacies were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. She finished her coffee, stood, and went inside. Tomorrow, she'd check the fence line, repair some weathered boards, continue the endless work of maintenance that mountain living required. But tonight, she'd sit by the fire and read one of Hollis's letters. She still had dozens unread, saving them like precious resources. The cabin was warm, the door was locked, and the mountain stood guard outside. After 30 years of wandering, Tansy Greer had finally come home to the only place she'd ever truly belonged. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.